Good afternoon to many who are tuning in from Europe, including our participants in this discussion. This is a virtual Wilson Center program sponsored by our Global Europe program. Dan Hamilton, who is not on screen, is the new director of that program. We're very proud of it. And of course, we're very proud of the chair of that program, whom I will introduce in a moment. Most of you know that the Wilson Center is a nonpartisan institution, if there is such a thing anymore, but we claim to be a nonpartisan institution, and we're well aware of the extreme partisanship that grips the United States right at the moment. So if you think how hard it is to achieve bipartisanship in Washington, just imagine the impossible task of achieving tripartisanship. Well, that's exactly what Bosnia contends with and has contended with for the past 25 years, since the end of the devastating Bosnian War and genocide, which killed some 100,000 people, mostly along ethnic lines. The Dayton Accords, the subject of today's talk, along with the later 2013 Serbia-Kosovo agreement, ended the bloodshed and recognized Bosnia's three main ethnic groups reorganized Bosnia's three main ethnic groups into a Serb half called the Republika Srpska, and the other half belonging to Croats and Muslim Bosniaks. Bosnia's political system is incredibly complex, with full cabinets and parliaments in each half, as well as in the overall country, and three presidents to represent the three ethnic groups. It's so complex that you'd think it would never work. And sure enough, the government struggles to maintain, to remain functional while ethnic tensions persist. But violence is clearly much worse, much worse. And I'm someone who, as a member of Congress, saw the results firsthand when I was in Sarajevo in December 1995, right after the peace agreement was reached. And I visited Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia with a 20-member congressional bipartisan delegation. We met with Tudjman of Croatia and Milosevic of Serbia. We know what happened to them. And we saw the soccer stadium in Sarajevo, which was being used as a graveyard. Bullet holes were in the hotel walls. A glorious international city was in ruins. But with the specter of Vietnam behind us, those of us in the United States, and the horrors of Syria yet to be seen, the United States wanted to, and I think helped avert, the Western Balkans from yet another protracted, violent civil war. I was in Sarajevo again in 2010 with a bipartisan, bicameral delegation, including the late, great Senator John McCain. And in 2012, I visited the 4-year-old independent state of Kosovo, where there is a giant 11-foot statue of Bill Clinton right in front of the Capitol. But for all I've seen and learned about the region and the peace process, today we're going to learn the real deal from two people who, to quote the score from Hamilton the musical, were in the rooms where it happened. Carl Bildt was Sweden's prime minister from 1991 to 1994, foreign minister from 2006 to 2014. He's well known as one of the mediators in the Yugoslav wars, serving as the EU's special envoy to the former Yugoslavia from June 1995, co-chair of the Dayton Peace Conference in November of 95, and high representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina from December 1995 to June 1997. From 1999 to 2001, he was the UN Secretary General's special envoy for the Balkans, and he is talking to us from Stockholm. Baroness Cathy Ashton is the Bank of America chair of the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. She is a current member of the House of Lords, and was the European Union's first high representative for foreign affairs and security policy from 2009 to 14, first vice president of the European Commission from 2010 to 14, and the European Commissioner for Trade previously from 2008 to 9. As High Representative, she brought Serbia and Kosovo to an agreement in 2013 that began the process of normalizing ties. Both happen to be good friends of mine. And Kathy, I miss you. Come as soon as we can get on those things that Carl isn't sure what they are. They're machines and they have wings. We've all forgotten what they are, but as soon as that is possible, come back. We really miss you. Today's conversation will look back at the big and small issues that these two amazing people solved and didn't solve, and look forward to the future of the Balkans, including possible membership in the EU or NATO or both. But at any rate, if we want to know what to think about 25 years out, these are the people to help us think about it. And so please welcome ambassadors and ministers and your excellencies, Carl Bildt and Kathy Ashton. And I think we're starting with you, Kathy. Do I have this right? Okay.
Jane, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. It's a joy to see you, even if it's on Zoom. And I think we're all extremely keen to be able to get back to the time when we'll be able to do this for real in person. Carl and I were talking about this earlier and saying, you know, you miss that extra bit that you get from having the chance to be together. But it's an enormous joy, Carl, to be with you and to be talking about an area of the world and, if you like, a subject that you and I have discussed over many years together. You were very instrumental when I became the High Representative in drawing my attention to the need and the opportunity for Europe to be fully engaged in the Western Balkans, in our backyard, if you like, and to be taking responsibility for what happened. You have such a wealth of experience, a breadth and a depth of knowledge. So this conversation, because this is what we're going to do, and by the way, people listening, if you post your questions, I'll get to see them and I can weave them into the conversation. So don't just wait till the sort of question time at the end. Do send anything that you've got as soon as you like.
Kathy, let me interrupt. I forgot that. You have to email GEP, that's for Global Europe Program, at wilsoncenter.org with your questions. Excuse me.
That's okay, Jane. Thank you. So please do that, folks. Carl, reflect back 25 years on from the Dayton Agreement. There you are in Ohio in an Air Force base. You've said recently that peace agreements are rare birds. Usually you have a winner or you have a kind of uneasy truce that never really transforms into anything of significance. Just take us back, and lots of people listening will have no idea what it must have been like. So just give us a few memories from being in Dayton, how you got there, what it felt like, what were the sort of the sense of direction, and if you like, when you thought it might work.
Well, thank you, Kathy, and truly a pleasure to be with you and with Jane as well to discuss these issues. It is true that peace agreements, true ones, are rather rare. If you take wars, they normally end with one of them being victorious, or they, if you look at sort of the European area, they often end in some sort of frozen conflict. But what we have learned, and we have learned it now again, is of course that frozen conflicts can be unfrozen fairly fast. I mean, Nagorno-Karabakh is another one that is distinctly unfrozen as we speak, and we have quite a number of them around Europe. Bosnia is unique, or nearly unique, in having a very elaborate peace agreement with the intention both of ending the war, that was the imperative, and of trying to build a state that can function. That was not entirely easy. How was it then 25 years ago? Well, 1995 was a dramatic year. The war had been going on more or less forever, at least since the beginning of 1992, after massive failures of doing peace. And the massive failures were to a large extent due to disagreements across the Atlantic. And one of the lessons that I think was very clear to me is that you can't heal a country if the international community is divided, and it simply doesn't work. And then the situation became desperate from a number of points of view, primarily the summer of 1995. That made it possible to heal the divisions across the Atlantic. There was a sense of desperation, both in European capitals and in Washington, that made it possible to come together, to merge a couple of different peace plans that had been on the table, and do a real rush for peace with all of the instruments available. Dick Holbrooke was, of course, the leading actor on the American stage, but there were quite a number of others. And we ended up at an Air Force base in Ohio, fairly strange. Among the strangest things, I have to tell you that story, is one of the first, or I think the second evening we had arrived there, sort of war criminals and peace criminals together at this strange place, and Dick Holbrooke wanted to have a dinner, and they did. And in Dayton you have the US Air Force Museum. So the dinner was done at the museum. So we were sitting in a round table with Milosevic and Tuchman and Izetbegovic and Holbrooke and myself under the wing of a B-52. And next to the table was a mock-up of a nuclear bomb. It was pretty bizarre. And then we spent sort of 3 weeks, none of us, and we had the first deputy foreign minister of Russia, Igor Ivanov, as well. We spent 3 weeks there. None of us thought that was going to last that long. And it was close to break down several times on details. We had already agreed on the framework for the peace agreement, but devil is always in the detail. And particularly when it comes to territorial divisions, there's not a square meter that you can not fight a war over, if I exaggerate slightly. But we came out of it with a very elaborate peace agreement. And US was then part of sending in a very substantial military force to help with the military implementation of that. Wasn't that necessary in my opinion, but it was done. And then I had the task of being sort of coordinated the civilian implementation. And then Bosnia, I think there was an expectation from some people that sort of it was going to be Switzerland within a week or two. It didn't turn out that. It's going to have been a fairly slow peace. But after a civil war, which is controversial, some people say it's Serbian aggression, but I would say it was a civil war in former Yugoslavia, no question about that. And there were several civil wars. Come to Kosovo, Serbia later. Civil wars are very divisive and very painful because it's not only army against army, it is peoples against peoples. And that means that the healing process is also very slow. Sorry for long answer.
No, I think that was a really, really useful, kind of getting us to understand some of the underlying issues about what you were doing in Dayton. And Richard Holbrooke, who I talked to a lot, I had the opportunity before his untimely death about this area. He also described that dinner, saying in retrospect it was kind of quite a weird occasion. But that's not unusual, I think, in negotiations. You find yourself in odd places for huge lengths of time, arguing about things you would never have expected. Ending a war, building the peace are two sides of the same coin, but they're not always the same thing. And I just think when we talk about Dayton now and we look back, you often hear, well, it's very complicated. Could it not have been made more simple? Do you look back? I mean, I know hindsight, of course, drives everybody crazy who wasn't there, who was there, because it's often said to you, and it's been said to me on things I've negotiated, you want to say to them, you should have been there. You should have had an understanding of what it was actually like trying to get even where we got to. But other things that you look back on and think there were moments when perhaps it could have been a bit different? Or do you think that this was the best agreement possible, which is what I suspect you do?
Well, I wouldn't say the best agreement possible, because there are always things that you think that could have been done somewhat differently. But first, the imperative was to stop the war. That was made easier, sorry to say, by the previous failures. People and all of the parties to the conflict were really fairly exhausted. Going into another winter of war in the mountains of the Balkans, that scared people. So there was an urge in order to sort of close it down. But then closing down a war is easier than building a peace. Because what Bosnia had when the fighting stopped was 3 armies, 3 sort of ethnic armies, militias / whatever, 3 sort of semi-states, 3 currency systems, 3 flags, 3 whatever. There was nothing. That was called Bosnia. It had all been sort of divided into that particular war. There was a sort of an alliance between the Muslims and the Croats, of course, but they had also been fighting their war, so there was a separate Croat state as well. So the task of peace, while the military implementation was to separate the armies, the civilian implementation was to bring everyone together again in a constitutional structure. I was saying, and I've written about that, we should have devoted more time to the constitutional structure because it's a very complex one. I think we would have, had we done that, we would have ended up with some things that in details might have been better, but the essence, I don't think would have been very different. We ended up with something that is not quite Belgium, which is another complicated place, but better than Cyprus. Which is a complicated that doesn't work at all and has sort of broken apart. And our hope was to have something that made it possible for them to start to work, to live together and work together, and eventually perhaps move it in the direction of Belgium, if that should be an ideal, these words, that can be discussed, because that's a place where it takes even longer time to form a government than in Bosnia these days. But what we had to work with was first the previous peace agreements that were, or peace plans that were on the table, the Federation Agreement and the other things. So there was a legacy of documents with different drafts. And then we had to work with the parties, what they wanted. We could never impose, you can never impose a peace. You need an agreement to negotiate with sort of an Izetbegovic and a Milosevic and a Tudjman and whatever. And they were fairly deep down in the sort of structures that we ended up with. They were coming from the legacy of Yugoslavia, not from the legacy of Sweden or the United States. And that's one of the key reasons why we ended up where we were. It's, after all, it's their country, not ours.
That's right. And it's often the case that when we talk about what happened and how it's turned out, we forget when we visit these individual countries, that was not how it was, that you were creating something against a backdrop of war and terror and horror, and the kind of breaking up of something that we'd all understood in part, Yugoslavia, into something completely different. So the creation was a sort of double creation in a sense of trying to work out what to be done. So looking back and then looking forward, and we've got a question that came in from Ryan from Balkan Insider, which is actually what I was going to go to next. So I'm going to incorporate Ryan into my question, if he doesn't mind, which is, you know, when we look at it now, and you and I have both visited Sarajevo many times, when you sit with the 3 presidents and you look at the different structures that it currently has and some of the gaps because of the structures being the way they are. Do you see things, because you were there at the beginning and you've kind of followed it and worked with it all the way through, do you see things that you would say now are ways that we could begin to make it operate better? Are there things that, particularly when we're trying to kind of push it or pull it towards the EU, are there areas where you think, well, actually, it's time to really examine this area or that area that would help it function better as a state?
Well, there are quite a number of things that I think they should do better, but I stress that they should do better. There are those who linger, so have the illusion that we could turn Bosnia into sort of a protectorate and dictate everything. I don't think that's either doable or desirable. The Bosnian politicians, of whatever political or whatever cultural background they have, they must take responsibility for their own country. I don't think they have been doing that, because too many of them have been seeing peace as the continuation of war by other means for too long. So there have been these sort of battles along this sort of ethno-nationalist lines all the time. that has made it very difficult. And that has meant, for example, that in terms of what I would call fundamental economic reforms, they haven't really done what needs to be done. They have huge deficits in a sort of bloated and semi-corrupt state-owned sector. The rule of law works very badly indeed. If you read the latest report from the European Commission, you know, Kathy's annual evaluation, it's fairly horrible at times. And that is the responsibility of the elected politicians of Bosnia. They should have done, in my opinion, better. That's easy for us to say. But that is because they have been conducting politics for quite some time under the prism of the conflicts, and not under the prism of what do we need to do in order to make it an economic success. And accordingly, I think the biggest problem that Bosnia has today is that young people are leaving, which is not only Bosnia, it applies to nearly the entire Balkans, by the way. But that is because they don't see really the economic prospects there. And that's the true tragedy at the moment. And if we can do anything to sort of impress this reality upon them 25 years after Dayton, I think we should do it.
I think the last time I was in Sarajevo, which is not very long ago, youth unemployment was running at about 38-39%. That was pre-COVID.
No, and Sarajevo is a booming place, but go elsewhere.
And, you know, young people I met when I was there were all hoping to go and work elsewhere, parts of the EU that they planned to go to, not necessarily because they wanted to leave, but because they didn't see the opportunity.
No, I mean, people in Bosnia have a deep attachment to their country. It is a lovely country in a number of respects. I mean, fascinating, lovely, beautiful, you name it. But it doesn't come out of the trenches. The politics of Bosnia is trench warfare. And they need to come out of the trenches and focus on the country as a whole. Then it has a substantial potential, but it has a long history to overcome. That's true.
So years later, I become High Representative, and you and I talk about the Western Balkans, and I begin a series of technical discussions to begin with Serbia and Kosovo, Pristina, Belgrade. I recall very well that, you know, the advantage I had was, although these were places which had huge problems, where the north of Kosovo we probably would have described as wild, like the Wild West. And although there were difficulties and challenges, we were not dealing with the immediate problems of trying to prevent or stop a war. We were trying to create the circumstances where relations could be more normalized, is the expression that we came to use. And it was the capacity to do things incrementally that made that possible. You and I talked many times about it, because I think when I began the political talks with the two prime ministers, Dacic coming from Serbia, Dacic coming from Kosovo, it did not seem a very likely outcome that we would get any kind of success. And I recall very well that even when the conversations between the two of them became easier, and if you like, more normal, that it would very quickly become clear the minute you added anyone else into the discussion that it was back to a very challenging, difficult relationship where people were very entrenched in their views. Nonetheless, we managed to get to the first agreement, the Brussels Agreement, as it's called, which did begin that process that I've, as you know, long hoped would continue at a pace. And you and I are thrilled that Miroslav Lajcak is now taking that forward on behalf of the EU, and wish him every possible success. But thinking about that, you know, I wondered what you thought at the time, and how you think, looking back, that incremental approach, was it the right thing to do? Should we have gone for a much quicker, stronger agreement that pushed it more in the direction that I think Miroslav is going to try and go?
Well, good question. Let me first say that there's a big difference between sort of the Bosnia conflict and the Kosovo Serb one. In Bosnia, very superficially, but I would say that there's very little hatred in Bosnia. The Bosnian conflict was driven by mutual fears, and those mutual fears were, to a very large extent, had their background in what happened during the Second World War. And what happened then was far more horrible than what happened during the 90s. And there was the fear from respective all sides that it was going to come back again. And that was driving or making the conflict easier for those who were fueling it to drive it. The Serb-Albanian conflict in Kosovo is a much harder one in terms of feelings. I mean, in Bosnia, people understand each other. I mean, it's the same language. I mean, they pretend it's different language, but it is the same language. Serb-Albania, well, we're talking about very different things. Incremental versus big. First, well, Kathy, you didn't have an option because the Kosovo War, spring of 1999, was ended with 78 days of bombing campaign that didn't lead to very much, as a matter of fact. I mean, there was an effort at a military solution, didn't really work. And they had to do something rather quickly with the help of the Russians, an agreement that didn't really sort it out, that sort of made it unclear what was the status of Kosovo. And that is what was left to you and others. Had you then the possibility to go for a big bang? No, I think that option, if it was there, had gone. And the only option that is there now is an incremental approach. That's more difficult, more time consuming. The advantage might be that you need to work through the different details very, very thoroughly, as you know, than if you do for the big bang that you can do when you are really in a desperate situation and needs to end a war. So I don't think there was any I never saw any alternative in the Serb-Kosovo than an incremental after the war ended without a peace, because the Kosovo war ended without a peace.
I think I agree with you, but it's always interesting to reflect what you would do differently, given the opportunity again. And I think the reflection that we had to go slowly was that, in part, we were responding to the reality of where Serbia and Kosovo actually were in the politics and in the strategic thinking that they were doing about their future. And it was very clear to me that, as is still the case, Serbia was not recognizing Kosovo, and we were not asking it to. And equally clear that Kosovo saw itself as a nation, and we were respecting that. And so you had this big red line that ran between those two thoughts that we could bump up against, but we certainly could not cross. And as long as it was understood that that was respected, which it always was, we were able to make progress on what was essentially about giving people who were suffering as a consequence of the chaos a better life, sorting out the police, the justice systems, and so on, the things that people needed, and the customs and border crossings and opening gates 1 and 31, as I recall, which was so important to the day-to-day economic and general life of the people who lived in the north of Kosovo. That was really important, but it was at the heart of it a project too, to bring people together to think about, in terms of the region, a common future to that extent. What would that look like? We were not dictating it. As I often tell people, I wrote not one word of the agreement. It was their words. I typed it in the end because it was easier for me to sit with them and type it. But it was not the EU telling them this is what it should be. It was their ideas translated, checked legally, of course, but written down in that way. So it's a very sort of a different process. not easy, very complicated, and still very complicated. But I think a process that enabled us to get at least that far. The question is getting them beyond that.
Oh, that's going to be a fairly painful process. I mean, Serbia will have to come to terms with the fact that Kosovo is a different nation and an independent state. But that lies fairly deep in the history, in the Serb national thinking. So it's not going to happen the day after tomorrow, but it will happen at some point in time. And in the meantime, of course, to be able to have the two economies and nations working together and ease the situation for people between the two countries, but also, as you know, inside of Kosovo, which is a far more Albanian place these days than it used to be. A long time being predominantly Albanian, but of course there is still a substantial Serb minority there, and other minorities as well that must have their future protected.
But of course, for all of these countries, places in the region, there is an aspiration for a European future, to be part of the European Union. I'm very conscious that I sit in London as I say this, but actually there is no question, certainly in my mind, that that is where they ultimately belong. And so the issue then is, how far is the EU enlargement project alive and well, and how far have considerations which are both for the 27 nations domestic in nature, but also looking out to the future, are about the needs and aspirations they have for their own country, and their concerns about importing, let's call it that, with due regard to the sensitivities, importing issues that they don't want to add to an agenda that feels pretty full. So from your perspective, how are we doing, or how is the EU doing on the enlargement project?
Well, so is perhaps the sort of slightly undiplomatic answer to that. But I think we share that view. This is absolutely critical to the future. I mean, what happened during the sort of 10-year long period was a process of violent dissolution in the Western Balkans. It wasn't only, or disintegration, it wasn't only Bosnia, it was all through the region, and Kosovo. The problem North Macedonia, Croatia, whatever. It was 10 years of the breakup of Yugoslavia with a lot of blood being shed. Now that was closed down incrementally in the different places, but has to be replaced by a process of integration. And the only process of integration that is possible is the one driven by the European Union, by them being part not of a new Yugoslavia, that's unthinkable, but being part of the Europe of which they are part. I mean, this is part of Europe, which is a long history of being part of Europe. And the important decision that was taken by the European Union in 2003, Thessaloniki, was to say, yep, we recognize this, you have a place in the EU, you will all become members at some point in time. But of course, membership in the European Union is a rather demanding thing. Lots of things that you have to follow, the rules of the game, the competitiveness, the rule of the law, lots of things. And as long as their politics have been dominated by the issues of the past, refighting the issues of the wars, it's been difficult for them to take the decisive steps towards the European Union. That has been, we can blame them for that. Then, of course, to blame us. Of course, there was a period for a long time when the politics of the Balkans was high up on the political agenda in Brussels and Washington and elsewhere. And there was an awareness, there was an engagement, there was a knowledge. That is no longer the case. The Balkans is unfortunately fairly low down on the agenda. And there's been a lack of attention by Brussels and by key capitals. And that has also made this process, the necessary process of augmenting the forces of integration, much slower than I would have wished. And that also makes it more difficult to address the individual issues, be those in Bosnia, or be that between Serbia and Kosovo, because they can only be addressed long-term within the framework of a process of European integration. There's simply no other way.
Well, I agree with that. And my memory is very distinct of, as well as trying to manage the discussions between Serbia and Kosovo, I was also managing the discussions between the 28 EU nations who took different views, had different perspectives, had different priorities, and who were not necessarily, in some cases, as interested as I would like them to be, or indeed were concerned or wary about even opening accession talks or moving forward on trade discussions and so on in this period. And yet, when you are trying to sell a proposition inside your own country, particularly at the end of something that has been so horrendous, you know, to say to people in one, you know, in Pristina or in Belgrade, look, we have to find a way forward with the other, then incentivizing that process is quite important. And a feeling that there is a kind of commonality of your future is also extremely important. And I think that's true, by the way, in Bosnia today, that the sense of direction and the direction that we want to see them move in, which is extremely tough, becoming an EU nation is very difficult, very complicated, requires lots of adjustments and changes. And it's a process that
It's
takes
even very difficult to get out of it.
Well, right.
Sorry.
Right. You know, what can I say? And, you know, it's all of that, but it also needs a kind of hefty shove, a hefty push from the European nations to sort of feel that that's something that is worth doing. So it's a very complicated jigsaw puzzle of trying to make sure all of these things happen, and not necessarily at the same time, but the direction's there.
No, true. And of course, you might say that the politicians of the Western Balkans, they were, it's the wrong word to use, but I will use it anyhow, spoiled, because there was high level attention to the Western Balkans. I mean, they could see every leader they wanted to see, and every leader they've ever heard of was coming to talk to them and trying to sort things out. We've gone since quite some time into a period of what can be called Balkan fatigue. I mean, the Balkans is not as high up on the agenda in Washington as China, I would guess, to put it very mildly, to just illustrate it by that. And that has meant that our leverage has decreased. I've always argued with the politicians of the region that they should be happy for the Balkan fatigue, because that means that they are no longer in acute crisis. They're becoming normal. And normal nations are not subject to high level attention by Washington or Brussels. But it's been difficult for them to adjust to the fact that they are not on the top of the agenda. They are fairly low down the ladder. And also difficult for Brussels and Washington to calibrate this, not to forget them completely, but continue a level of engagement that is necessary, because they do have their challenges. They do need our attention. There are significant issues to be sorted out. And if they're not sorted out, things could start to go wrong.
You know, the whole question of the calibration across the Atlantic is really interesting at the moment, because we've had perhaps different approaches trying to get in the direction of change. We've seen the photos of the prime ministers of Serbia and Kosovo sitting in the White House and so on. And we don't quite know what's going to happen next week. We can be confident, I think, that whoever is in the White House, this is still going to be on the agenda, because Vice President Biden visited the region many times and is very interested in it. And clearly, President Trump has put energy into it. The difference, I think, will be how far that coordination works. Jane, I know you want to ask a question. So because we're talking about America, do you want to come in and ask your question then I'll try and weave that into.
Okay, well, I think it fits here, and this is a fascinating discussion. And I just wanted to say, I think you're both being too hard on yourselves, looking back at what wasn't perfect. As a mother of four, I know, and I don't know if either of you is a mother of four, that perfection is not an option. So forget about it. You achieved something really special, both of you, and that leads me to think about diplomats and the role of diplomacy, which is what I want to ask about, especially from the American perspective. Neither one of you is American. Surprise. And there was a phenomenal American involved in this process. We mentioned him, and he was a dear friend of mine too, Richard Holbrooke, who was larger than life in every possible way. Not always fun and pleasant to be around, but an astoundingly bright and determined man. And way back in the day, there was an American diplomat named George Kennan, whose family has named the Russia program at the Wilson Center, and his long telegram is still probably the gold standard for diplomacy. So here's my question, as a broader question, and that is the role of diplomacy in this age of toxic partisanship, not just in the US, but around the world. I mean, is there room anymore for the kinds of discussions you had, whether you went far enough or not? And are there Americans, is there an American appetite to generate, or maybe there are some people I'm missing, the great diplomats like you and like Richard Holbrooke was, and like George Kennan was?
Kathy, start with that one.
No, I think you should, Carl. You were a prime minister. You know more than I do.
I don't. I mean, the simple answer to that one is, of course, yes. It is absolutely imperative. Be that in Brussels, or be that in London, or be that in Paris, or be that in Washington, diplomacy is absolutely essential. Yeah. You can't sort out the issues of the world with war. You have to sort it out, try to sort it out with diplomacy. There's a time for coercion at some point in time. There's a time for deterrence. There's a time for defense. But diplomacy has to be there at the forefront of the efforts. And if you look at the lessons of primarily Bosnia, but it applies to Kosovo as well, the failure, because it was a massive failure for a number of years to close down the war in Bosnia, was the fact that there was disagreement across the Atlantic. And it was only when we closed that particular divide across the Atlantic in the summer of 1995 that it was possible to make peace. And then it has to be said also, the divide across the Atlantic was to a certain extent a product of a fierce divide in Washington. Jane mentioned Dick Holbrooke, larger in life in a number of respects. Dick has written a book about his experience. And I've said to him that, Dick, you don't tell the true story. Because the true story, where Dick Holbrooke was really phenomenal, was not primarily, I'm exaggerating slightly, making peace in Bosnia, but making peace in Washington. Because he, by maneuvering with all of the means that he used, and they were numerous, he was able to force, among others, to force Washington to come together on something that was reasonably realistic. And when that was done, it was very much in line with what Europeans had been talking about, and then it became possible. So, and that, he was a diplomat with undiplomatic means, right. But he achieved diplomatic results. And he understood very well that sort of this transatlantic thing is absolutely critical.
But can you name, Carl or Kathy, a great diplomat of this age? I mean, including yourselves, of course, you won't go there, but is there some new star on the horizon, the next Dick Holbrooke, either in the US or somewhere, who's dazzling all of us with his or her skills?
I doubt we would know them at this point. You see, the thing that I've always tried to emphasize is that most diplomacy is not loud and shouting. It is done extremely quietly, often over long periods of time, by people who, when the photograph arrives, step to the back of the photo of the line,
Right.
and let the usually politicians step to the front. And I've seen that for real. I've seen that happen lots of times. You know, the other negotiations I dealt with, the Iran talks, the people who negotiated that for years were absolutely extraordinary. But when it came to the photograph, you have to look to find them, because that's not where they want to be. And so Dick Holbrooke was an unusual combination of both using diplomatic tools, but in a very politically motivated way. So he was larger than life because he could combine those two things, whereas normally they operate more separately, in my view. To answer the original question that you said, we can't do anything now unless we A, collaborate with each other, and B, end up trying to find solutions. In the Serbia-Kosovo talks, when things got very difficult, and they often did, I would point out that they could go off and do something else. They could end up in conflict with each other again, but they were still going to end up around my table eventually, because there was no other way. And so let's not do any of the bad stuff. Let's keep going with the sitting around a table. It's what the European Union project was all about, solving the problems by leaders coming together. It's not easy. It's never going to be easy, but doing it through dialogue and discussion and diplomacy, not doing it through means that Europe has too often seen, which are destructive and terrible and horrific. So there is no other solution. All of these conflicts end up one day, one way or another, having to be resolved through diplomatic means. And there are some amazing American diplomats out there. There are some amazing Swedish diplomats, there's some amazing British diplomats, there's some amazing European Union diplomats. I've had the good fortune to witness quite a lot of it. They're not the same as those kind of larger than life characters, but that's partly because the world they operate in, especially now, is a world where doing things more calmly and quietly with a 24-hour news media buzzing around you is the only way, in my view, that a lot of this is going to get done.
So it's pretty amazing. I don't want to dominate this, but look at you two. Would you please stay safe? Don't get COVID and stay in the game. I no matter what you say, Kathy, I don't think we're minting a lot of new people like you and Carl. So Carl was about to say something. I didn't mean to cut him off, but I'm cutting me off after saying that you two are the gold standard. And sure, everything wasn't perfect, but look, we at least changed a war into a kind of cool peace. And could it be better now? I hope so. Anyway, sorry, Carl, I'm going to stop talking.
No, I was just going to add to what Kathy said, which I agree with. There were even some outstanding Russian diplomats. We should not forget that. I mean, I was very impressed in the beginning of my work with the Balkans that among the very best diplomats were the Russians. And the reason was, of course, that they had devoted attention to that particular area for longer than one had done in Stockholm or London or Washington, and had deeper knowledge about things. So there's a Russian diplomatic tradition that is quite impressive, that you can separate from present Russian politics to some extent.
That's completely true. And it was true again in Iran talks with China as well. We had Russia and China, both of whom played significant roles, and at various points in the process, crucial roles, I would argue. That takes nothing away from the role of the US at all, simply that 6 nations working together. But it goes back to the point that you made, Carl, that if you have agreement amongst the international community and the parties who are trying to achieve the goal, then things move better and more smoothly.
Yeah, because otherwise what happens, and we saw that during a fairly prolonged phase of the Balkan conflicts, is that the local parties spend more time getting support from the one or the other international actor than on actually sitting down with each other. But it's only when the international actors come together that they have to concentrate on really settling the conflict. That was clearly the case for the different playing on. They had different friends or semi-friends in the international circles, and that had a negative effect. When the international community came together, that had an effect.
Somebody's asking a question about how far the lessons that we've got from the Western Balkans, from, if you like, Dayton and from Serbia, Kosovo, how far they can be applied to other conflicts. You mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh, which is the one that's really moved, as you rightly point out, from a frozen conflict to something very different, and which it's hard, I think, at the moment to see the resolution to, especially because diplomatic work has been going on for a long time that now needs to move up. But the other one, of course, and the concern that we've all had is about what's going on in Syria.
Yeah, I was going to say that, Kathy, because both you and I were around in the beginning of that particular conflict. And there were moments when it would have been possible to get a more coherent approach, including Russia. But it didn't happen. And I think had that happened in the beginning of the Syria conflict, I think there might have been possibilities to do something at the sort of early or semi-early stage. Then politics of Europe, US, and Russia diverged heavily. The Iranians were part of it as well. It should not have been entirely impossible, I think, in the beginning to sit down around the table. And there was indeed an agreement in Geneva, negotiated by Kofi Annan, which fell apart within days. But had that been pursued with all of the painful compromises necessary on each side, might, we don't know, have worked.
I think, you know, one of the things that's quite important about all of this is trying to distill the lessons that work and that don't work, and the things that maybe you can at least try and apply across to another conflict. It also applies when you think about how countries get closer to the European Union and how far they get in. And there's a question that's asking, you know, would more EU conditionality, in other words, would requiring more reform early in the process help us to bring Bosnia and Herzegovina closer to the EU, or is that not going to work?
Good question. History happens only once, so we don't know what could have happened. But perhaps if we had been more clear with the European perspective earlier on, it could have had an impact. I don't know. But we took, after initial phase, we took a rather protectorate approach to peace building in Bosnia. And then somewhat later, we switched over from what we call from the push of Dayton to the pull of Brussels. And had we made the pull of Brussels somewhat stronger, perhaps earlier, who knows, could have made a difference. But I'd like to stress that again. We need to look at the region as a whole. It's only if we have a policy that works for the entire region that we can, within that context, start to have success with either Bosnia, or they can have success with either Bosnia or Kosovo, Serbia, or, which is more of a success story, by the way, North Macedonia.
So when you look at the region, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, it depends. I become pessimistic when I see how they have not been doing what I think they should have been doing during these years. At the same time, I mean, it is a region of talent, no doubt. It's a region of assets. It's a region that is profoundly European. So there's no real way why this should not be possible to sort out over time. But it requires a somewhat deeper European commitment by all of the political leaders of the region. And then we could be there, and we should be there, to be very strong in the support that we give them. But we can't do it. They have to do it.
Right, and as Dan Hamilton's just pointed out, you know, there are real issues about corruption.
Oh yeah.
Which is a problem that we've seen needs to be addressed everywhere for all of the reasons that we know, that it's impossible to drive an economy unless you can deal with it. It's impossible to sort out political life.
No, that the corruption problems have been real, and they have some of them still have the background in the war, because the war and heavy sanctions, that leads to a war economy and a sanctions busting economy, and that creates people who make a lot of money in busting sanctions and selling things in ways that they should not be sold. And those profits were there, and those structures, they were fairly multi-ethnic. They were amazingly multi-ethnic, by the way, those structures. They were, in that sense, not affected by the war. Those structures remained and have been quite a problem throughout the region for quite some time.
You know, when we think about the future for the region, I mean, I always err on the side of optimism, because I can't bear the alternative. And I do think that if you project far enough forward, it's obvious that the countries of the region should be very firmly attached to the European Union and be part of that. But they also need to develop within themselves as well, the kind of cooperation, economic growth, and so on. It's not only about traffic towards the EU, but it's also about how they relate to each other. And that, I think, you know, affects how people feel about the place they live, the country they live, the region that they live in, how proud they can be of their own heritage, but how much they feel part of a set of communities, or a community that is diverse.
And when I go back to optimistic, pessimistic, when I get optimistic about Bosnia, is sometimes when I go there and I encounter in the streets people who stop me and talk Swedish. Because we took roughly 100,000 refugees from Bosnia. Not too many of them went back. But they all go back all the time. And some of them are starting to invest in Bosnia, and they are coming back from Sweden or Germany or Austria or the UK or whatever, with an element of talent and with a dedication that goes well beyond what you find locally sometimes. Yeah. So you can walk the streets of the towns of Bosnia and encounter people that in the middle of the political stalemate that is sometimes there, and the economic difficulties, does fill you with optimism about the future of the country. And the same Kosovo, which is to some extent a more dynamic place than Bosnia. I mean, I remember I made the difference after the war. If I went to the most war-affected places in Bosnia, it was all silent. If I went to the most war-affected places in Kosovo, I could hear the hammers. I could hear the hammers of rebuilding all the time. So there's a lot of human talent there.
Right.
Carl, we're nearly at the end, so it leaves it for me to say a huge thank you to you for joining me in this conversation.
Thank
you. As I said at the beginning, it's always an enormous pleasure to see you. And as Jane said, it's so important that you continue to engage on these issues, which I know you will. I know you write about it. I know you visit. I know you are involved, but we are both, I think, as I said earlier, huge fans of Miroslav Lajcek and his work that is ongoing, and are always at his beck and call, as I told him the other day, should he need us. Jane, I'm going to hand back to you for a moment.
All right, I'm still here. I'm still listening. What you just said to Carl also applies to you, Kathy. No excuses. You have to stay in the game, and your service during the JCPOA negotiations was so incredibly valuable, and your service to the Wilson Center is too. I wanted to give a final shout out to Dan Hamilton, whom I know. I don't see him, but I know he's involved in this call. He is our new director of our our Global Europe program. And I think his question about corruption is important too, because it didn't start in the Western Balkans, but it is there, and it is in many parts of Europe, and obviously in many parts of the world. And it's another thing we have to keep our eye on. So I want to be optimistic too. Why would I have served in politics as long as I did if I weren't an optimist? But I also want us at the Wilson Center, with help from Carl, and of course help from you, Kathy, and a focus by Dan, to focus on how we can help governments end endemic corruption and provide better service, because as you both said, it's up to them. It's not just up to us, the outsiders, to make the place work better. So thank you both. Big hugs, big virtual hugs. And I hope to see you both soon. Take care. And to our audience, thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Stay well. Bye-bye for now.